My name is Joseph Spencer, and this is my video for Comp 435 final project. For my attack, I will be doing the forced entry zero-click iPhone spyware, also known as the no-click iMessage attack. First, I want to give a general introduction of my attack. This is the no-click or forced entry attack on iPhones in 2021 was done by the Israel NSO Group. They are an organization who specializes in hacking to sell to governments. The NSO spokesperson Zamir Dabash said about this company. Our mission is to help make the world a better place by providing authorized governments with technology that helps them combat terror and crime. This group created an attack that allowed the attacker to gain access to an iPhone without the user having to even click anything, with the attack vector being through iMessages on iPhones. The New York Times reported that once the spyware gained entry, it could read text messages and emails and track calls and contacts. It could even record sounds, collect passwords, and trace the whereabouts of the phone user. Now, this spyware was one that was used to target specific people, with SiliconRepublic.com reporting that the victims of the spyware were journalists, politicians, government officials, chief executives, and human rights activists. Now, the first major question that comes up is, how did the original intent of the company to help make a world a better place create a product that was hurting it? Now, this is currently being investigated, but it looks as if the clients that the spyware was sold to have misused it for harm. And this leads us to the investigation into the motivation behind the spyware and why it is very important to study. The first fact is that the widespread users of its attack vector. Using an attack vector that has more potential targets will always be a good thing for the hacker. Backlinko.com estimates that 1 billion people use iPhones worldwide, making it a very large target, one which is hard to miss. Now, this is one of the motivations for the study because the risk population is so large, and it comes out to be 13% of the global population have iPhones, or 1 billion. Another reason for this attack is important to study is this level of sophistication that causes the attack to use no user interaction. The attack only needs a phone number, which are easy to find through public information, social media, or other records, and this makes the attack even more dangerous and important to look at because it only needs a piece of almost public information to gain access. The user just has to have an iPhone that uses iMessage, and then they can be hacked. Now, the last point of motivation is its ability to both spread like a worm and be highly targeted. Imagine if this attack was modified slightly. Once it gains access to a phone, it would have access to the contacts of the phone, but then it would replicate and send the attack to all of their contacts. Now, if we assume that everyone has at least 100 contacts, then we would reach all 1 billion estimated iPhone users in less than 5 cycles with perfect efficiency and no duplicates. The math is each set gets multiplied by 100, so we have 1 to 100 to 10,000 to a million to 100 million to 10 billion. And this can also be highly targeted, which is what they actually did. They chose high-level targets. This 1, overall reduces the visibility of the attack, and 2, is less likely to be discovered, which makes the attack even more dangerous. As we can see, this dual threat of the attack is extremely dangerous and versatile, further motivating the study. Before we go into the actual attack, I'm going to go ahead and give some background information as a refresher on the technical details of this attack. The first of that is integer overflow. An integer overflow happens when an unsigned integer is at the end bounds and it wraps around, creating an unexpected result. Now look at this picture, for example, and we see an 8-bit binary of all the numbers are 0, representing the number 0. What happens when we add 1 to this binary number? Well, we get the binary number 1. Now that's logical, of course, but what happens when we do it again? We get 2, again, logical. And we can repeatedly add 1 to this binary number until all the bits are filled with 1. And at this number, what happens when we add 1 again? This is the edge case. This brings us to this edge case. And then when we add 1 again, it'll go into the first bit, and it'll become 0, carry the 1 to the second bit. Now it becomes 0, carry the 1 to the third bit, and it'll go all the way to the leading bit. And there's nowhere for that 1 to carry over, and we end up with the number 0. So this is integer overflow when it wraps around and comes to an edge case. Now, the next technical detail to go over is buffer overflow. A buffer overflow is where we allot more memory for things like arrays than there is data. As we can see in this picture, the array for password has 8 letters and is represented by the orange boxes. But 12 spots, the extra 4 represented in blue, were allotted. Now the computer will then fill in whatever memory is beside the original password spots and giving the attacker access to this memory in which they can choose to rewrite and have access to any way they want. Next, we want to go over the attack vector. Here is how the attack happened per trendmicro.com. First, the attack is made possible through iMessage image attachment processing. So for the attack to happen, the attacker will first send the victim an iMessage with a picture that contains the data for the attack. As iMessage processes the attack, the vulnerability is located in the function jbig2stream read text region segment of the core graphics framework. The crash happens at the memory location of 0x181D6E228. Now here's a screenshot of the function. Pause the video to take a deeper look. The vulnerability starts in this code as it begins to process the unsigned integer variable num_sims. Here's a quick screenshot of JBig symbol dictionary segment. In this screenshot, we see the integer overflow. Trendmicro.com explains it like this. The type of num_sims is unsigned integer, and the return type of function segment getSize is also unsigned integer. Therefore, num_sims could be smaller than the size of one JBig segment due to integer overflow. This is the main point of attack for this attack. Now that the code has a number that is larger than the size of one JBig segment, the attacker can utilize the buffer overflow attack. In this code, the code allocates the heap buffer sims with our bad variable num_sims multiplying it by 8. Now the heap buffer is much larger than it's supposed to be and sims are filled, but it will not fill enough, giving the attacker access to the extra spots in memory. Remember the orange bits in our array. At this point, the attacker is able to install the spyware by inserting their malicious code. As said earlier by SiliconRepublic.com, the reported targets of the spyware are journalists, politicians, government officials, chief executive, and human rights activists. The real breakthrough as it developed is that the Bahraini government allegedly purchased and developed this spyware against human rights activists. Now, this is the breakthrough that led us to this investigation that exposed the spyware and shown the extreme danger when in the wrong hands. It is scary to see the thought of the reach of governments into personal life, privacy, freedom of speech, and human rights. Apple did release an emergency fix in iOS 14.8 to patch this buffer overflow, and here we can see their fix. On lines 158 and 170, boxed in red, Apple added 2 boundary checks for num_sims to not allow overflowing the sims buffer. And as you see in box in red, these will prevent integer overflow, and which will in turn prevent buffer overflow. Finally, we will analyze the attack, look at the response to the attack, and look at what we should learn from overall consequences. First, we need to analyze the attack. The attack is extremely sophisticated and will most likely very expensive to develop. Attacks like these are made to be targeted so that they do not get discovered and can be exploited for as long as possible. This is both a bad thing and a good thing. First, it's a bad thing because people that are attacked will be attacked for longer because it won't be discovered, but it's also a good thing because the everyday user will not need to worry about an attack like this. Second is the response. It is interesting to see that it is the smallest parts of a code that can cause so much damage. As we can see, Apple put out a 2-line fix that solved the vulnerability, but attackers were still able to find and use this as an attack vector even though the vulnerability was so small. Finally, we have the consequences. This was a good lesson to the general security community that even the smallest issues need to be addressed. This was 2 lines of code that needed updating, but it was a fatal flaw in Apple security. It was also a good lesson in usability. Messages and open forms of communication are great for usability, but can open the door to so many attacks. The only way to prevent this specific attack is to completely turn off the iMessage in iPhone. But this drastically reduces the usability of the phone, even though it protects the user. Here are my citations, and here are my questions.